but we're recording. So this is our first session on wrestling with the Apostle Paul during Eastertime. Why wrestling? Because the Apostle Paul tends to generate strong responses or strong emotions from people. I teach Paul a lot in my work at Luther Seminary, and invariably at the start of a semester, there are people who find Paul heroic and inspiring and a model to be imitated. And there are people who can barely stand to read anything he wrote, and everywhere in between. So if you're anywhere on that spectrum, you're in good company, I would expect. If you've never read Paul and don't know what I'm talking about, you're also in really good company. We will spend some time with Paul. Paul wrote a lot. He's one of the people who contributed the most to the New Testament. That doesn't necessarily make him important, but certainly over the way in which his writings have been read and interpreted and used in the way the church has thought about what it believes and why it believes that, Paul has been an incredibly influential figure, kind of a formidable figure in the life of Christian faith. And so it's helpful to know some things about him. We could spend months talking about Paul. That would be a lot of fun. I'd be willing to do that sometime if you want. But instead, for 5 weeks, we're going to try to focus on kind of what Easter means to Paul. And by that, I mean, what becomes possible because of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ in Paul's mind. Paul sometimes talks about different things that God has done through the death and resurrection of Jesus, and we will spend 5 weeks looking at some of those things. But what I want to do tonight, I hope you won't mind, is to take this opening session to also provide a bit of just very general background about who Paul was. Chances are some of you know a little bit about him and maybe have some questions about him. So I want to spend the first maybe 15 or 20 minutes offering a general background. Who was this person? Why should we care about who he was, who he is, and what he wrote? What shaped him? What formed his imagination, his ways of thinking about God? And to start off with that, I'm actually going to show a very short video. It's about 5.5 minutes. It's a video that's kind of dated. This comes from an old special that Peter Jennings, the journalist, did. This is maybe like 15 to 18 years ago. I've forgotten the exact date. So it's a little bit out of date in its scholarship, and the people that he interviews could be a little more diverse or representative for sure. But they say some good things about Paul, and they put a variety of perspectives on the table. And it seems like a really good way, from my perspective, in just 5 minutes to kind of lay out some issues related to Paul and how we study him and who he was. The quality of the video is not great. This originally started as a VHS tape in my possession that eventually got scanned and is now online and now being transmitted over Zoom. But I think if the video is not great, the audio should work out okay. So bear with me then as I get this started. You'll hear Peter Jennings in the background and see a variety of biblical scholars offer some short sound bites about Paul, and then we can talk about what they have to say.
The result of all this engineering genius was the globalization of the first century. Before long, people and ideas were going all over the place.
It's a world in which people are having more and more contact with people who are not like themselves.
When you look at those cities of the ancient world, they were absolutely multicultural. Africans, Parthians, Iranians, Greeks, an enormous range of people.
Paul is on the move too, from one city to the other.
And once he's gone to a particular town, he's going to announce the gospel to them, start a little community, and encounter some opposition. And when things get hot, sometimes, his life is in danger. He's a smart man, so he's going to pack his bags and move on.
Time and again, Paul makes someone angry. He often ends up in and out of prison.
If you were a civic official living in Thessalonica and you heard that somebody was standing in the public marketplaces making a whole lot of people very angry, you might get suspicious. Often it's unclear whether his opponents are Jews or other Christians or Jewish Christians or Gentile leaders or leaders of the Roman Empire. All of them, at one point or another, are his enemies.
Wash my troubles away, Lord.
He has to move a lot, and in each place that he goes, the situation develops a little bit differently. He doesn't seem to make friends easily.
Paul was always writing to the people he left behind. His letters are now an integral part of the Bible. Christians consider them sacred.
Paul says, look, nobody may listen to me, and my whole life may blow up in my face, and I might die, but I'm going to keep saying what I'm saying because that's what I believe.
Paul might be surprised to find that Christians now read his letters out loud in church and try to live by them, too.
He never anticipates that 20th century Americans are going to be his audience. He has no idea because he thinks the world is going to end.
Originally, the letters were Paul doing crisis management.
Everything was not just peaches and cream in these churches. There were a lot of problems that developed, and they had to be addressed.
We have in his letters, his efforts to salvage situations in churches that lay behind him on his path.
There were all sorts of problems. The end of the world was not coming soon enough for some. Others wanted to know if the rules for life had changed now that they had been saved by accepting Jesus.
Should we continue to have sexual relations? And what do we do when we do have conflicts in the community, one person wanting to sue another one?
Should we all be monogamous? Should we sleep around? Should we sleep with the cult leader? Should we all be like angels?
If the world is really to end soon, does it pay to get married? Does it pay to have a family? Is there any point in living what we would call a normal family life so close to the end of days?
What's interesting is that Paul's passionate, intense responses to immediate situations and immediate questions have been taken since then as blueprints for 2,000 years of how people should act and what their sexual behavior should be and what other behavior should be. People have taken Paul's letters as if he meant them to be blueprints for the Christian church, as if he expected a 2,000-year church so far, which he certainly didn't.
In some ways, Christian theology was written on the run.
I would think of him writing on napkins somehow. I mean, what I mean is, on the run, during the travels, trying to dash off a message, not a great deal of reflection and long thought.
Paul didn't have any notion what was going to happen next. And we know that because he gives us about 8 different versions of what's going to happen next. And he clearly was making it up as he went along.
Paul was a genius because he wasn't doing this in a book-lined study or in a library or in a university with sort of peacefully able to pursue his vision. His public life, he gives an account of it. He's being chased out of town, he's in prison for causing an uproar and disturbing the peace, he's on the run, he's staying in people's houses, he's traveling, he's getting shipwrecked, and from a series of ad hoc inquiries from the churches about various practical matters of discipline, he creates a new theology which has worked for millions of human beings.
Well, I hope you like that. Makes me want to travel. So when this is all over, we'll go to Greece and Turkey together, and we'll do this class again there. It'll be much more fun. That 5-minute video, I love it mostly for the very end, and the comment by it's Karen Armstrong, who says that Paul's letters are mostly responses to these immediate practical problems. And yet in the course of those letters, either Paul was creating or we read out of those letters a bigger theology, a bigger system that has in many ways been foundational to Christian faith for a long time. one of the other things I appreciate about the video is that it brings up the sense of urgency that we see in a lot of Paul's writings, that he does appear to believe that we are living at the end of time, that Jesus will come back, that world history is about to come to an end. And so that affects the way he advises churches on how they should live. We have a sense of Paul's zeal in all of this, but also just this notion that he writes his letters while he's conducting a ministry. He's not somebody who stays in one place and has a great library and gets paid to think all day. He's very much somebody who's on the move and somebody who's working out theology in conversation with people throughout aspects of everyday life. And I think in some ways that affects the aspects of Paul's letters that are really positive and really inspirational. It also probably affects some of the ways in which his letters might miss some details that we perhaps would wish that they talked about. So that's just kind of a way of setting the stage and reminding us of who Paul is. But to give you a little bit more background as well, I want to walk through, again, some details about his life. And so to do that, I'm going to also show a slideshow here and talk my way through that. And when I'm done, I'll take a break and we can ask some questions as well. But I want to just kind of reintroduce or introduce for the first time Paul to us. And this is important, I think, because one of the discussion questions I'll ask, but something I want you to think about, is what do you make of Paul? I mean, who is he for you? Paul is often, in a lot of people's minds, connected to certain passages that have been used to limit people's participation in church, women in particular. Paul seems to be not willing to mount a vigorous criticism of slavery in the Roman world. Neither does Jesus, for that matter, in the Gospels. Paul sometimes gets read in ways that make him sound pretty overbearing and aggressive, but there are other ways in which Paul sometimes is much more gentle in his writings as well. So just to hold these questions in mind, right? What do we make of Paul? Who is he for you? Why do we even have these letters in the first place in the New Testament? That's a good question. And something that came out of the video, and I believe is true, is that Paul appears not to have written for the sake of creating or recording theology. In other words, Paul didn't sit down and say, people need to know what I think, or people need to have a theology that answers all of their questions about God from A to Z, or from Alpha to Omega. Instead, Paul wrote because he was in the process or in the business of serving churches. The way he talks about his ministry, he saw it as his calling to start new churches, to go places where there weren't Christian communities, and to try to gain converts and to try to create these new worshiping communities. And in the course of that work, he wrote letters. And he wrote his letters mostly because I think he was trying to help real ancient audiences, right? Real flesh and blood people. The church in Corinth in Greece was different from the churches in Galatia in what's modern Turkey. He was trying to help various audiences live out what it meant for them to be the people of God in their particular contexts. If I can make up a word there, he was trying to help people think Christianly, right? Or what does it mean to live in a Christian way? Paul is writing probably about 20 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, 20 to 25 years after them. He's writing to churches that don't have instruction manuals. They don't have a long chain of leadership. They don't have much in terms of tradition. They probably don't have Old Testament scrolls or Hebrew Bible scrolls. He's writing to churches that are trying to figure out what does it mean to be Christian, and he's writing to them sometimes because he's far, far away. So who are the people that he wrote to? He writes to churches, he writes to groups. That's important to recognize. Whenever Paul uses the word you or your, almost always those are plural forms in the Greek that Paul originally wrote in. In other words, he very rarely addresses individuals. He mostly is addressing whole communities, trying to shape their sense of identity, trying to shape their sense of life together. And his audiences were people he already knew. I say mostly. The one glaring exception to that is his letter to the Romans. It appears that he's writing When he writes to the Romans, he's writing to believers that he has not yet met, at least most of them. But the other letters that we're going to look at were written to audiences that he knew, people he had already visited, people that he had served among. So he's not necessarily writing to strangers. Why did he write? Good question. The simplest answer is because he could. Paul was apparently literate, although he also talks about how he had a scribe or a secretary who probably took dictation for him and wrote things down. There are estimates that maybe only about 10% of the population then was literate, could read and write. But letters were not necessarily rare things. If you could find somebody who would deliver it for you, who could do the travel, if you could find somebody who would write for you, if you could get writing materials, and if your recipients had somebody they knew who could read, then you might send a letter. We have examples of tons of other letters that have survived from the ancient world. So Paul was adapting a communication medium that was already very much in circulation. Why did he write? Mostly because the churches he wrote to were experiencing problems of some kind, or at least the potential for problems was always there. So a lot of what Paul is doing is crisis management, trying to help congregations that aren't getting along to get along better. In some cases, he's writing to congregations that are suffering persecution, trying to encourage them. In one letter to the Philippians, he's writing because he himself is imprisoned, and he knows the church in Philippi was worried about him, and he was trying to reassure them of his well-being. The letters allowed him to have a pastoral presence from far away. We don't do this so much in churches these days. The rules of denominations typically tell a pastor when they leave a church not to contact people there, not to get in the way of the new leadership. Paul lived in a different culture. He didn't necessarily have replacements, and so he continued to stay in touch with these churches, providing networks or forming networks, but also providing pastoral ministry from a distance. What are some of the things that we learn about Paul or about his own story from his letters? How can we read between the lines and see more about who this person was? This is a timeline. This reminds me, I'm going to give you a link to all of these slides. So if it's going too quickly, I'll give you a document that'll let you review these slides. This is all best guess, right? How do we know about Paul? We know because some of his letters were able to survive through the passage of time. We know because other people wrote about him. The book, The Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, tells some of Paul's story. After Paul is dead, we hear about him from other people. We know something about his legacy from how he was remembered. But best guess is that he was probably born between the years 5 and 15. The birth of Jesus is probably roughly around the year 5 BCE, 5 before the Common Era. So Jesus was probably born 10 to 25 years prior to Paul. Again, this is our best guess. Paul has a conversion experience somewhere between the years 31 and 35. I'll talk about this more in a little bit. This is when he meets Jesus, or he describes himself as having had a revelation of Jesus Christ, that as Paul describes it, the risen Christ revealed himself to Paul. Estimates around the death of Jesus, roughly around the years 27 to 33, depending upon who you talk to. So Paul's conversion experience took place when the Christian movement was still relatively young, right? It was certainly less than a decade old, probably more like 3 to 5 years max when Paul has his experience and then becomes a follower of Christ. Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 1 that immediately after his conversion experience, he went away to Arabia. From the perspective of somebody who might have been in Jerusalem, this is far off the grid. And then he's also in Damascus in Syria, north of Jerusalem, for 3 years, pretty much on his own. We don't know what he does at all during that time. There's no record of what he did. Then he tells us that he took a visit to Jerusalem, probably between the years 34 and 38. This was his first visit to go and to meet the Christian leadership of the church in Jerusalem. And if you read Galatians 1, all of those verses in advance, you'll know that Paul was not super impressed with the church in Jerusalem, or at least he didn't he didn't regard their knowledge as essential to him. He already was pretty confident he knew who Jesus was and what the gospel was all about. Paul then tells us that he goes on and proclaims the gospel in Syria and Cilicia. This is kind of northwest of Syria. Again, in a really big span of time, roughly between the years 33 and 51. So a significant amount of time Paul is doing ministry. We don't know if he's successful or not. We don't know how many partners in ministry he has. We don't know much of anything about this period in Paul's life, to be perfectly honest. Then Paul tells us he goes back to the Jerusalem church 14 years after the first time. So if you're doing math here, that's roughly around the years 48 to 52. And that's where Paul kind of hammers out his beliefs with the other followers of Jesus who are centered in Jerusalem. And Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 2 that as a result of this meeting, everybody agreed that Paul should go and preach the good news to Gentiles, to non-Jews, while the Apostle Peter and others were going to focus their attention on preaching to Jewish audiences. But they recognized that there wasn't a fundamental difference in their message. They just had different audiences that they felt compelled to go and speak to. Then Paul conducts ministry in a variety of places, Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, Achaia to the west, over toward Greece, Corinth, part of Greece, Ephesus, that's Western Turkey, Macedonia, just north of Greece. He's covering a lot of ground, roughly for a decade. And this is the period of time where the letters that survived and are in the New Testament came from. The letters were probably written between the years 50 and 58. And that's where we get our best evidence, or our kind of the best data about Paul and his life and his teachings. Paul was arrested several times, from what he tells us. Chances are his final arrest and imprisonment probably took place between the years 55 and 58. He writes a couple of his letters from prison. We're not sure exactly where he's imprisoned or how long he was imprisoned, but that was his final move into custody. And then he is executed. We are told in other sources that don't appear in the New Testament that he was executed in Rome during the reign of Nero. The execution probably between the years 60 and 64. That's the life of Paul in terms of if you like dates and if you like activities and things like that. Another way of looking at Paul is to ask the question of, well, what does he contribute, right? Or what makes him interesting? Why do people fight over Paul? What makes Paul a distinctive voice in the New Testament? Well, for a variety of reasons, and some of these reasons are also reasons why Paul was a controversial figure, even back in the first century, why he remained a controversial figure after his death, and why for a lot of people he remains controversial even today. So I'm going to go relatively quickly through this slide. Paul's place in Judaism. Paul describes himself as a good, loyal Jew, a practicing Jew, but then who turns to follow Jesus, and as a result has some critical things to say about the way in which he formerly believed. Questions about what did Paul know and how did he know it? Paul never knew Jesus during his earthly ministry. Paul only tells us that he had some kind of a revelation of Jesus and that the risen Jesus appeared to him. How did Paul get his information? Did Jesus tell him things? Was Paul's mind miraculously filled with information? Did Paul study? Did Paul interview other Christ followers? We just don't know exactly where he got his news and how he worked all of this out. He doesn't describe that process for us. Paul was a fierce advocate for Gentiles. The hallmark of Paul's ministry was to tell non-Jewish audiences about Jesus Christ and then to welcome them into the Christian church without their having to follow aspects of Jewish law. So he insists that male believers don't need to be circumcised. He insists that Sabbath observance is not required, that other kinds of Jewish festival observance is not required, that dietary laws don't need to be followed. He thinks that as long as Gentiles have expressed faith in Christ and have received the Holy Spirit, they are full members now of the family of God. So that kept Paul incredibly under fire during a whole lot of his career. Paul appeals to scripture a lot. He is he's frequently quoting from the Old Testament, trying to find ways in which the Old Testament bears witness to his beliefs about Jesus Christ. He appeals to certain traditions and confessions. Paul knows things about the Lord's Supper, for example. He has the so-called words of institution that you hear at every communion service. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he describes traditions about Jesus appearing to his followers and things like that. So he has some information about what the larger church believed. Paul's arguments and his ways of being persuasive, they aren't always persuasive to us, but Paul is using rhetoric. He's using forms of argumentation that were quite popular among Greek-speaking audiences of his day. It reminds us that Paul had a pretty decent education as far as we can tell. Paul's tenacity. This is a guy who never gives up. Paul describes himself as a zealous anti-Christian persecutor prior to his conversion experience or his new calling to follow Jesus. And Paul remains tenacious even afterwards. He appears to have been one of those people with incredibly zealous personality. Paul's suffering makes him controversial. He talks a lot about his sufferings and his hardships. It appears that in some churches, his suffering becomes a reason for people to despise him, right? Like, well, if Paul's so great, how come he's always getting himself into trouble? Paul wears his sufferings as a kind of badge of honor, as kind of a validation of his own fidelity to Jesus. Paul has a vision for new ways of living and new ways of being in community that his churches don't seem to embrace very easily. He has a kind of non-hierarchical way of viewing things sometimes. Other times he seems to revert to hierarchies, especially around men and women. But nevertheless, he does seem to think that the good news is not just about believing new stuff, but about ordering communities in different ways. I think it's fair to accuse Paul of some short-sightedness, of overlooking some things. I think it's probably fair to accuse me of short-sightedness, and probably all of you, right? We all don't often see the implications of our beliefs, and we harbor hypocrisies. And I think there are ways in which Paul might be guilty of that as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point. And also Paul's conversion makes him interesting and in some ways controversial. I talked a little bit about that, but just to note one thing that he says about himself, and this is one of the passages that circulated on Friday in an email I sent around to all of you. Just a really short passage from Paul where he's talking about his background, his history, where he says, I too have reason for confidence in the flesh, right? If anybody wants to boast about their achievements, I'm happy to play that game. If anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. So he goes on this boast here to describe, just how good his life was, how much privilege he had, how much advantage he had prior to meeting Jesus. He was circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel of the tribe of Benjamin, right? He was reared in a Jewish household. He was obedient to the law. He describes himself as a Hebrew born of Hebrews. As to the law, he was a Pharisee. So he was raised in a Pharisaic tradition or educated in a Pharisaic tradition, which probably means he did a lot of scripture study, a lot of focus on law observance in his own life. He says, as to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, I was blameless, right? He was law obedient. He loved the law. He followed the law. Paul doesn't appear to be somebody who was tortured by a guilty conscience prior to meeting Jesus. He presents himself as somebody who was a Jew, who was quite content with being Jewish, who found himself kind of living in the mainstream of Jewish life, and yet something happened that changed his perspective. And then he goes on, whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss because of Christ. In other words, he says, it's not about these things that I did or the kinds of ways I embody the tradition. For him, it's because of Jesus. So he tells us a few things about himself here in this passage. He tells us some more things in Galatians chapter 1. He tells about his conversion. This is just a short little bit of Galatians 1, where he says, the gospel that was proclaimed by me isn't of human origin. I didn't receive it from a human source. I wasn't taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. This is kind of one of the places where I kind of step back and say, well, what did that look like? Does this mean when Paul went and lived in Arabia for 3 years that Jesus appeared at the campfire every night and they talked shop? Does this just mean Paul had a brilliant theological idea and worked it all out himself? We're really not sure. But Paul does say that he's not dependent upon other human witnesses for their testimony about Jesus, but that he discerned the gospel, discerned the good news through a direct revelation from Jesus. He goes on in Galatians 1 when he says, when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, when God was pleased to reveal God's Son to me, so that I might proclaim among the Gentiles. This is part of a longer sentence, but that line that God was pleased to reveal God's Son to Paul, we could even translate that as in. That's a better translation of the Greek preposition there, right? Paul sees somehow Christ being revealed in him. I bring this up because it's different. There's kind of a mystical element to Paul that we need to pay attention to, but also just to point out this, and I'll take a break in just a second, I promise. That Paul talks about his religious experience as an experience of Jesus Christ revealing himself to him. But Paul also seems to believe that he bears that revelation his very own self. In other words, it wasn't just intellectual or cognitive, that Paul sees Christ revealed in his own body, in his own experience. He describes things in his letters as if he was a full participant, right? Paul's very existence somehow participates in the presence of Christ, the life of Christ, and the benefits of Christ. This is one of the reasons why Paul, I think, likes to talk about himself so much and why he likes to dwell on his hardships, because he sees his own life as a kind of tapestry on which the good news of Jesus has been painted, right? Or he views his own life as a kind of demonstration or a kind of paradigm about how God is present in the world and that God transforms people's lives in the power of Jesus Christ. It's as if I don't think that Paul is saying that he's the best convert that's ever been, but Paul is saying there's something about his life, there's something about his experience that models or illustrates the ways in which God works. God breaks in when nobody's expecting it. God reorders Paul's whole understanding of holiness and of truth and of communicating with God or communing with God. And it turns everything upside down for Paul. That's part of Paul's zeal. That's part of Paul's own religious thinking, that he's not a guy who sits around in the library all day. He's somebody who has this deep religious experience that he tries to live out, and he sees aspects of his own life reflected in the teachings that he provides to the churches that he's in communication with. That I promised 20 minutes. That went a lot longer, didn't it? But I hope that's useful in some way, shape, or form. There's a link to the slides in the chat if you want to pull those up and have those for yourself. But let me pause there and just ask if there's any. We haven't really talked about Jesus yet. We're just talking about Paul. If there are any questions or any comments or things that deserve more clarification at this point.
I have a question.
Yes, Art, please.
You keep referring him as writing to the Christians. Christianity wasn't named as Christianity until a couple hundred years later. Was he not writing to the followers of the way, not to the Christians?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. That Christian, like the first appearance of the word Christians we find in the book of Acts, it's probably written very end of the first century, maybe early second century. So we don't know exactly where that term comes from. Paul doesn't use the term Christian. Paul will talk about believers, for example. I'll sometimes use the word Christ follower, just to remind us that Christianity as a separate discernible religion hasn't really emerged yet. I'm trying to think now if Paul uses that term the way or not. I have to look that up. I know the book of Acts certainly does, and it's there in some of the Gospels. So that's important to note, right? Paul is writing and doing ministry at a time where nobody really views the Christian church as something totally separate from Judaism, right? There's not a sense of this being a different, discernible religion. There is some conflict and some ill ease, perhaps, about just how much does belief in Jesus Christ fit within Jewish communities, but for the most part, it's still kind of seen as an offshoot. Maybe that's even not the right word to use. Still kind of a component within the larger umbrella of Judaism during Paul's life. Paul is in one of his letters in Romans, he's starting to discern that Jewish audiences are less receptive to this message than Gentile audiences are, and that's causing him some concern. That's a letter probably written around the year 58 or something like that. And certainly by the time we hit the year 100, what we call now Christianity and Judaism are really starting to diverge.
Another question, if I may.
I'll try to.
Paul obviously was literate. The followers, as described in the Gospels, followers of Jesus, were not literate. It doesn't describe any of them as being able to write in Greek or anything. And yet the writers of the Gospels, who obviously were literate, never refer to Paul in writing in the Gospels. Isn't that strange?
Yeah, I'd say, three of the gospel authors don't. The authors of Matthew and Mark and John never mention Paul because their stories all leave off like at around Easter or soon after, and Paul's conversion a little bit later. The book of Acts almost certainly was written by the same person who wrote Luke's gospel. And so Paul appears there starting in chapter 8 as a persecutor, and then Acts tells a story of his conversion as well. So for the authors of Matthew, Mark, and John, yeah, it's hard to say. They also don't mention any other converts that come after Easter for the most part. But for Luke, Paul is very much kind of the author of Luke, Paul is very much an influential figure. I should note too, we've got mentions of Paul in a couple other New Testament writings. Whoever wrote 2 Peter mentions him as well. Well, they mentioned there and also in the book of Acts. But so sorry, Gene, you had lots of questions.
Matt, I don't know whether is my phone mic on? So
yeah, you're good. Yeah, Jack.
Yes. I think one of the difficulties that the people had at that time, and I think we still have it, is that he's walking around telling people that he met somebody who died. Not only did he meet somebody who died, but he's still with me and can be with you. That's really, really hard to accept and comprehend. We live in a black and white world. This table's real. I know it because I can touch it. You're real because I've met you more than on Zoom.
Yeah, my only answer to that is yes.
It's difficult.
I mean, we see this. There's a document from I think it's mid-late 2nd century. That's a Christian document, but it's very anti-Paul, and that's exactly its argument. Is like, are you sure you want to trust a guy who's had visions
of someone who's dead?
Exactly, right. Yeah, this is part of what makes Paul really controversial.
No question.
Yeah, I can't.
One more question.
I can't ease that offense. I can only acknowledge.
One more question, Matt. He claims to be of the tribe of Benjamin. Wasn't the tribe of Benjamin one of the 10 tribes who were completely destroyed and never to be heard of again? How can he be sure he was the tribe of Benjamin?
There's no way we can we can either confirm or deny that. That's my That's my deposition answer. I can either confirm or deny that. Certainly lost to us. It's possible that some Jews might have held on to those things, or traced their own lineage through the exile and restoration and things like that. And we do have other. There are other like Jewish writings from antiquity where people do still hold on to some of those tribal affiliations, but whether he's accurate or not, we just don't know. So I need to keep moving along. I see Margaret and Dwayne, and I think I'm gonna, after you two, I'll keep going so I can make sure I finish by 8. So Margaret, do you want to?
Well, yeah, there were other resurrection stories in the Middle East at that time. Other people who had claimed to be resurrected. So hearing about a resurrected person was not unheard of. But is it really impossible for Paul not to have seen Jesus when he was walking around teaching? He was a Pharisee. He was a upholder of the law. There was a prophet or a peasant out there drawing people to himself and talking about the law. They overlapped in time. I think it's quite possible that Paul might have observed Jesus, either in the temple or elsewhere.
I suppose it's possible. If it happened, we have no record of it. Like Paul never mentioned.
We don't have any record of it, but it wasn't that big a country.
No, I mean, Paul does describe himself as being from Tarsus. So he's technically not from like within Israel or Palestine. So if he was a little bit younger, it's possible that he just might not have been there.
Certainly he went to Jerusalem.
Right. We don't know when and how he gets to Jerusalem, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't the Bible say that he was there for the stoning of Stephen and they threw their coats on the feet of Paul?
Yeah, that's his first appearance. That's in Acts chapter 8, where Stephen is killed and there's a young man there named Saul who is on coat duty for the stoning, and that kind of launches the persecution that Paul's involved in. Sorry, my internet connection's unstable. Hopefully everybody heard that. I don't know if I'm glitchy or not. Yeah, Dwayne.
So quickly too, on identity, he does refer to himself as apostle, right?
He does in his letters, yeah.
And he addresses churches. So, I mean, he doesn't use the word Christian or Christianity, but is there something we need to know about his usage of apostle or church that would help clarify what we've been kind of dancing around?
Sure. The word church is a pretty ordinary church. It was already in circulation. It's a Greek word that means gathering. And if you were a stonemason, you would belong to an ecclesia of other stonemasons. It was kind of a social or political or trade gathering, and that's just the term that gets used to describe these communities of Christians. So they're the ecclesia, the group that's called together. So that the term church isn't necessarily novel or controversial in any way. The term apostle is interesting because Paul uses the term for himself. He insists on his own kind of standing as an apostle. And for him, so the question is, well, what in the world does that mean? Apostle just means delegate. It's literally the one who is sent. It's like an ambassador. The way that the Gospels tend to use the word apostle, the way that the book, The Acts of the Apostles, uses the term apostle, is usually kind of reserved to the 12, the so-called 12 disciples, or also the 12 apostles. Like, it's kind of a minimalist understanding of who the apostles are. Paul has a more like maximalist understanding, sees there being more apostles. I think the best hint for this, for what that means for Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he describes Jesus as appearing to his followers. And then he says, and then Jesus also appeared to 500 more. And then Paul says, and then he also appeared to me. And he said, and he calls himself the least of the apostles because he was a persecutor of the church. I think based on that passage that Paul understands apostle as a term reserved for people who encountered the resurrected Jesus and were commissioned to do ministry on his behalf by him. You see what I mean? So I think if Paul were to join this Zoom call, that would also be really weird. But he would say there are no more apostles. The apostles were that first generation of people who had a resurrection experience and understood themselves as called into ministry. So Paul insists he's part of the club because he had that experience. He had some kind of visionary experience or some kind of out-of-body experience. It also means that for Paul, the apostles are not just the other 12. It includes this much larger group. So in Romans, he refers to a woman as an apostle in Romans 16, who we don't know anything else about, named Junia. But that's interesting. He names her and a man named Andronicus as outstanding among the apostles. So for Paul, apostle could be a much broader group of people. And what makes them important, quote unquote, important, I think, for Paul is that they do have some kind of firsthand knowledge or some kind of firsthand testimony to share about Jesus. Doesn't mean it's not weird, like was commented on before, right? I'd say it's weird for anybody to have that testimony, but at least, Peter or Mary Magdalene and the others can say, well, we knew who he was. For Paul, it's this remarkable religious experience that he claims. And I don't say that either to make him like more or less trustworthy. I'm just saying this is what you get with Paul, that you're reliant on the testimony of somebody who's claiming this extraordinary experience, which is one of the things that makes him really interesting and also really zealous. I mean, the guy appears to have never stopped in terms of just his single-minded pursuit of trying to share this good news with people and trying to form Christian communities that could sustain themselves. All right, we'll keep doing questions. I'm happy to do questions. I think that for 5 weeks, we'll probably have lots of questions. And if I didn't get to any tonight, feel free to email them to me and I can either try to answer them by email or also save some time in the next coming weeks. But I do want to now kind of pivot to what's Paul so excited about. A lot of this is Paul's own experience. Like I said, if you find Paul a controversial figure, you're in very good company. He was in the first century. He was in the second century and forward. And over the next couple of weeks, we can talk more about how we kind of evaluate Paul and things like that. But I want to spend a little bit of time in the opening chapter of 1 Corinthians, which is the first letter he wrote to the believers in Corinth. And I want to look at briefly at this passage. Paul's writing to a church that's beset by factions. It's a church that appears to be having some real problems with divisions. There are some groups in the church that understand themselves as better or more spiritual than others, and they're kind of lording that over them. And so Paul's trying to get this church to get along a little better and to cooperate a little bit better and to break down some of the factions. Hard to imagine a church would have factions, I know. But so he says this: the message about the cross, right? The message he preaches is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. So he draws this distinction between the foolishness of the cross and this idea of God's power. Then he says, for it's written, and this is God speaking here through the mouth of Isaiah, and this is a quote from the Greek translation of Isaiah 29, verse 14, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Now Paul goes again, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom. Remember, Paul is both of those. Paul's Jewish, but he's very much educated in a Greek system, so to speak. But we proclaim, now he's kind of defining the church separate from those groups, right? Jews demand signs, Greeks desire wisdom. We proclaim Christ crucified, which is a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. So Paul loves wordplay, which makes him sometimes hard to translate. He loves things like paradox as well, which we see going on here, right? This idea that the cross creates a paradox. He understands the cross as playing a role in God's salvation, but the whole thing looks like foolishness from the outside, right? So he's saying, from the perspective of Jews, nobody would see a person crucified and would say that looks like the promised Messiah. Nobody in the Greco-Roman climate would see somebody who died in such a shameful way as a savior, right? Or somebody who would be worth following. It's hard to generalize about the Greek and Roman gods, but for the most part, if a Greek and Roman god ever shows up in some of the stories about them, they're going to exercise power. They're going to either mess up humans' lives, or they're going to make sure that wars end in certain ways, or things like that. But Paul's acknowledging here that this message about a crucified God has a real marketing problem in the first century among Jewish audiences and Greek audiences alike. But Paul is looking at the cross with this kind of upside down logic, saying that what appears to be utter powerlessness or a religion based on foolishness, right? The idea of a savior on a cross is paradoxically stronger than human strength and wiser than human wisdom. Paul doesn't really elaborate so much on that, but I think part of what's going on here is that Paul is saying the crucifixion provides a key to understanding who God is and how God operates. I mean, Paul still believes in a God who possesses power, who possesses strength, who possesses wisdom. But Paul seems to be suggesting here that this God shows those things, perhaps not in the ways you would expect, but somehow through this upside down logic of crucifixion. Part of, I think, what Paul is saying here about what he sees in the crucifixion is a God who isn't interested in using power to dominate rivals. Or rather, maybe Paul is saying that shouldn't be the perspective of the church. The church's mode of being shouldn't be about dominance, shouldn't be about forming factions that are going to overpower other factions. But rather, if we want to see God's power at work, perhaps we should align ourselves with Christ's own experience of weakness. And so in this letter, if we would read the entire letter, we might see this. In a lot of ways in this letter, he tells people with power to put aside their power for the sake of the other. He tells people to put aside their advantage for the sake of creating a Christian community that can operate harmoniously. The crucifixion for Paul is a story about a God who relinquishes power as opposed to a God who inflicts power on others. One more slide. Later on in 1 Corinthians, this is in chapter 3, he says this to his audience: "Don't you know that you're God's temple and that God's spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person." That's not pleasant. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. So again, he's helping people define who they are, right? He's doing this kind of explanation of what are you and what is your body and what is your body good for, right? It's the place where God dwells. And then he goes back to this wisdom and foolishness thing, right? The wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, for it's written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they're futile. Here he goes again, quoting from the Old Testament. Then he says, "So let no one boast about human leaders." And here he's referring to the factions in this church. "For all things are yours, whether you're Paul or Apollos," another early Christian leader that Paul was partnered with, or Cephas, that's another name for Peter, or the world, or life, or death, or in the present, or the future. all belongs to you, and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. Something else that Paul sees going on then through the Christian message, right, is it's a message of belonging. It's a message of becoming yourself sanctified or made holy, becoming God's temple, that God dwells within you. And as a result, you have this security, right? This notion of belonging to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. He's trying to, on the one hand, do an end run around human authorities and the things that they like to fight about and the kinds of factions they like to create. But he's also saying that your true identity is wrapped up purely in Christ and purely in who God is. What does that look like? Well, we'll talk about that more in coming weeks, but at least for tonight, there's some big language from Paul about security and identity. He doesn't view the cross so much as a transaction necessarily, as much as it's this moment where God remakes things and where God claims us. And again, we'll unpack that more in weeks to come. But right now I want to celebrate because it's 8 o'clock on the nose and I hit my mark, which rarely happens if you've been hanging out with me before. Usually I go later. But since it is 8, I'll say this. If people have to check out, that's certainly fine. I do have some small group questions that I'm going to share with us. There might also be some large group questions if I've totally confused anybody or made a mess of things. I'm happy to deal with that. If you have questions and you're thinking I'm totally lost or I don't know what's going on or what in the world is happening with Paul, you're also welcome really at any time to email me also, and I'm happy to try to bring some of these up. Paul evokes, like I said at the very beginning, a lot of strong feelings, and that's fine. Some people have been beaten up with letters from Paul in the past. Actually, I shouldn't use the expression beaten up because sometimes violence is a part of the way in which scripture gets misused. But I mean, people have found Paul's writings and sometimes oppressive in their own lives, and we should talk about that if you want to. Plenty of other people found Paul to be liberating and, like I said, inspiring and allows you to soar, and that's also part of it. My goal for the next 5 weeks isn't to make you like Paul or to hate Paul. I have a complicated relationship with Paul myself, and we can talk about that if you want to, psychoanalyze me. But it's to I think it's to reckon with the way in which, for Paul, theology is not just about here are the things you really ought to believe. Paul really wants to pull you into a kind of lived encounter with God, and Paul sees that as possible or as happening somehow through the cross and resurrection of Jesus. All right, so I've pasted in the chat the questions I created. You're welcome to take those with you if you want. Otherwise, we ready for small groups? Or are there any questions that are burning right now that I should answer to help all of this make more sense? I think I've been talking a mile a minute. Margaret, I see your hand.
Yeah, just one quick one. Does Paul use Greek, the Greeks, to mean everyone who isn't Jewish?
In that reading, I think yes. It's kind of synonymous with Gentile for him in that case.
Because I'm kind of wondering where the Romans are.
Yeah, it's still in this case they're living in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, so for them, kind of everybody's Greek, everybody's speaking Greek. Yeah. All right, should we break into small groups then? Questions are in the chat. If you prefer a link, you can do that. So if you're new to this, I just usually make random small groups. Your Zoom will tell you how to get there. And I usually just kind of bounce around from group to group, and I'll call you all back here around 8:25. One of the things that we didn't get to, and I think one of the questions can help you with, is just the issue of how does all this speak to our world today? And like I said, it's been a tumultuous last 36 hours or so. But some of this idea of wisdom and foolishness might be worth an interesting conversation. So I think the groups are set. You should have a box to click to join your group, and I'll just kind of vagabond around and maybe see you in the groups.